The hotel manager called me exactly 1 month after my wedding. His voice was so serious that I stopped washing the dinner dishes, dried my hands, and sat down at the kitchen table. "Ma'am, I noticed something terrible," he said. "I need you to come here immediately, and please don't tell your husband." For a few seconds I thought he had the wrong person. My name is Rachel Bennett. I was 48 years old, and I had been married to Daniel for 31 days. 31. The wedding thank you cards were still stacked in our spare bedroom. 2 unopened gifts sat beside them, and a piece of our wedding cake was wrapped in foil in the freezer. So when the manager of the hotel where we had gotten married told me not to tell my new husband about something he had discovered, my first thought was that somebody had stolen something. "What happened?" I asked. "I'd rather show you," he said. That answer made my stomach tighten. The hotel was the Hawthorne Hotel in downtown Columbus, Ohio, where Daniel and I had held our reception. It was an older brick building with tall windows and dark wood trim. About 70 people had attended. My sister had cried during the ceremony. Daniel's brother had embarrassed himself on the dance floor. My mother's old friend had complained that the chicken was dry and then gone back for another plate. It had been ordinary in all the best ways, at least that was what I believed. I drove downtown that afternoon and parked in the garage across from the hotel. I sat in my car for almost a full minute before getting out. I almost called Daniel. That was the strange part. Even then, my first instinct was still to tell my husband. I didn't. I walked into the lobby and found a man in his early 60s waiting for me. "Mrs. Bennett." "Yes, I'm Frank Miller. I'm the general manager." He shook my hand quickly. "I appreciate you calling me Frank, but I still don't understand what this is about." He glanced toward the lobby. "Come with me." We walked into a small office behind the front desk. There was a desk, 2 computer monitors, a coffee maker, and a wall covered with schedules. Frank closed the door. "I want to be clear," he said. "I don't normally get involved in people's marriages." I stared at him. "This is about my marriage. I don't know what it's about. That's the problem." He opened a security system on the computer. "After your wedding, one of our employees reported a missing key card. We reviewed the hallway footage and noticed something unusual. He clicked through several recordings. Then I saw Daniel. It was 10:47 p.m. on the night of our wedding. Daniel was walking down a hallway I barely remembered. He wasn't alone. A woman in a dark blue coat followed him. I leaned closer. "Who is she?" Frank didn't answer. The woman caught up with Daniel near a service entrance. He looked around before opening a door. Then both of them disappeared into a private meeting room. I stared at the screen. "Maybe she's a guest," I said. Frank nodded slowly. "She might be, but she wasn't registered with your wedding party." He clicked to another camera. 20 minutes later, Daniel came out. The woman followed. Daniel was holding a large brown envelope. I felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not yet. Just the realization that I had never seen that envelope. What's in it, I don't know. Then, "Why did you call me Frank?" paused. "Because of who the woman is." He enlarged the image. Her face became clearer. I knew her. My mouth went dry. "That's Karen Wallace." Frank looked at me. "You're sure?" "Yes." Karen had been Daniel's former business partner. During our courtship, he had told me they had a business disagreement, that she moved on, and that they hadn't spoken in years. He had never mentioned her coming to our wedding. Never. I watched the clip again. "Why would she be there?" "I don't know," Frank said. "Did you see them arguing?" "No." "Did you see them kiss?" "No." That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Frank showed me another clip. Karen had approached the front desk earlier that evening. The audio wasn't available, but the employee remembered her asking for Daniel Bennett by his full name. I sat back. She had come looking for him, at my wedding. Frank printed a still image from the footage and handed it to me. "I'm giving you this because I think you need to know what happened. But I can't tell you what it means." I folded the picture and put it in my purse. "What do you think I should do?" Frank looked at me. If it were me, I'd find out what's in that envelope before I asked questions. On the drive home, I kept the radio off. I passed the exit toward Dublin and tried to tell myself I was overreacting. A woman from my husband's past had appeared at our wedding. They had met privately. There had been an envelope. That was all I knew. When I got home, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen island eating a slice of our wedding cake straight from the freezer. He looked up and smiled. "Hey, beautiful. Where have you been? Just running errands." He nodded. "Want some cake?" I almost laughed. Instead, I watched the man I had promised to trust for the rest of my life. That night, while Daniel showered, I checked his phone. I knew I shouldn't. His messages showed nothing obvious. Neither did his recent calls. For a few minutes, I felt ashamed of myself. Maybe I was inventing a problem. Then I noticed the home computer. The password had been changed. That was the computer where we kept our household budget tax files and financial records. I tried the old password. It didn't work. I stared at the screen, and for the first time I wondered what my husband had decided I no longer needed to see. For the next week I did something I had never been particularly good at. I pretended everything was normal. Every morning Daniel came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. He liked his with 2 sugars and just a little half and half. I had started keeping the small carton on the refrigerator door because he complained that cold cream made his coffee taste like diner coffee. That week I poured it anyway. He kissed me before leaving for work. He texted me around noon. He asked what we should have for dinner. From the outside, we probably looked like a newly married couple settling into a comfortable routine. Inside my head, I was replaying a 20-minute security video over and over again. Daniel, Karen Wallace, a brown envelope, and a private room at our wedding reception. I kept the photograph Frank had given me inside an old recipe book in the kitchen. I don't know why I chose that spot. Maybe because Daniel never cooked. That was one small thing I could still count on. On Tuesday morning, I called my friend Linda Harris. Linda was 56 and had worked in the office next to mine for years. She had a practical way of looking at problems that sometimes irritated me and almost always helped me. We met at a Panera Bread in Dublin during my lunch break. Linda stirred her coffee and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have proof your husband is having an affair?" "Do you have proof he's stealing from you?" "No." "Then don't accuse him of either one." I looked at her. "That's your advice." "My advice is to stop guessing and start paying attention." She took a bite of her sandwich. "And don't do anything stupid." I checked his phone. "That was stupid." "I know. Did you find anything?" "No." "Then you're lucky." I laughed despite myself. Linda smiled. "Rachel, you're married. You don't need to become a detective because a woman in a blue coat showed up at your reception. But you also don't need to ignore something that bothers you." That afternoon I started with our bank account. Daniel and I had opened a joint checking account after the wedding. I handled most of the household bills because I had always been the organized one. The first few transactions looked ordinary. Gas, groceries, electric, a payment to Nationwide. Then I noticed several transfers. $200, $300, $400. They weren't huge amounts, but they were frequent. The description said things like consulting and reimbursement. I kept scrolling. Then I saw one for $8,500. My finger stopped on the screen. I took a screenshot. When Daniel came home that evening, I waited until after dinner. We were sitting on the couch watching an old episode of Blue Bloods when I said as casually as I could, "What was the $8,500 consulting payment?" He didn't look at me. "What payment?" "From the joint account." He reached for the remote and lowered the television. "It's a business expense." "What kind, Rachel?" He sighed. "Do you really want to start auditing every dollar I spend?" I stared at him. I asked one question, and I answered it. "No, you didn't." His face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The warmth disappeared. "It was for consulting," he said. "That's all you need to know." I didn't argue. I nodded. "Okay." He leaned back and turned the television up again. I sat beside him, but I wasn't watching the show anymore. That night, I went into the bathroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the tub and cried quietly. Not because of the money, because I had asked my husband a simple question, and somehow I had ended up feeling guilty for asking it. I wiped my face and looked at myself in the mirror. "You're not crazy," I whispered. Then I immediately felt foolish for talking to myself. Maybe I was becoming one of those women who read too much into everything. The next morning I made another mistake. I called Karen. She answered on the third ring. "Hello, Karen Wallace." A pause. "Yes." "This is Rachel Bennett." Another pause. Then Karen said very quietly, "I was wondering when you'd call." My stomach dropped. "You were at my wedding. I know." Why, Karen exhaled. "Rachel, you really don't want to know what Daniel is doing." "What does that mean?" "It means you need to be careful." Careful about what? She didn't answer. "Karen, I can't talk about this over the phone. Then tell me where to meet you." Silence. Then she said, "No, not yet." "What does that mean?" "It means Daniel isn't the man you think he is." The line went dead. I called back. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. By the time Daniel came home that evening, I had convinced myself I should tell him. Instead, he walked through the front door carrying flowers. "What's this?" I asked. "Just because." He kissed my forehead. "You've seemed stressed." I looked at the flowers, then at him. "I'm fine." He smiled. "You know you can trust me, right?" There it was. That sentence. I wanted to believe him so badly that for 1 second I almost did. Then I remembered the brown envelope. 3 days later I went back to the Hawthorne Hotel. Frank looked surprised to see me. "I thought you might come back. I need to see more footage." He hesitated. "Rachel, I don't want to become part of this." "I understand. But if there is something going on, you deserve to know." He pulled up the security system. This time he showed me a different camera. Daniel and Karen were leaving the meeting room. Daniel handed her the brown envelope. Karen opened it before walking away. Frank zoomed in. The image wasn't perfect, but I could make out several lines of text. My name, Rachel Bennett. Then another line, Bennett Property Holdings. I stared at the screen. "What is that?" Frank shook his head. "I don't know. I did, or at least I thought I did. My mother had left me a small commercial property in Westerville when she died. I had never thought of it as a fortune. It was simply something my mother wanted me to have. Daniel knew about it, but I had never told him the exact value. I thanked Frank and drove home. I opened my laptop and searched Franklin County property records. The first few pages were boring. Then I found it. A new business entity, Bennett Property Holdings, LLC. The filing date was 6 months before my wedding. I stared at the screen. 6 months. Before Daniel and I had said our vows. Before we had even sent out the invitations. Before I had bought my wedding dress. I heard the front door open. Daniel was home early. He walked into the room and saw my laptop. His face went completely still. "What are you looking at?" I closed the screen. Nothing. He didn't smile. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said, "Rachel, what exactly have you been doing?" And I realized something. He wasn't asking because he was concerned. He was asking because he was afraid. I didn't answer Daniel's question. I just closed the laptop and said, "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." He stood there for a moment. Then he gave me a strange little smile. "Okay." That one word followed me upstairs. I could hear him moving around in the kitchen while I changed into pajamas. A cabinet opened. Water ran. A glass clinked against the counter. Normal sounds. That was what made everything so unsettling. Nothing in our house looked different. The framed wedding photo was still sitting on the mantel. My shoes were still by the back door. Daniel's golf clubs were still leaning against the garage wall because he never put anything away properly. But I was looking at all of it differently. The next morning I called an attorney. Her name was Susan Harper. She was 59, had an office in Dublin, and came highly recommended by a woman at my dental practice who had gone through a complicated divorce 2 years earlier. Susan didn't ask me to tell her every detail over the phone. She simply said, "Bring whatever documents you have. Don't change or delete anything." I met her that afternoon. Her office was in a quiet brick building near Riverside Drive. There was a bowl of peppermints on the reception desk and a framed Ohio State photograph in the hallway. I handed Susan the property records. She read them twice. Then she looked at me. "Rachel, When did you get married 36 days ago? And when was this LLC created? I looked down. 6 months before the wedding. Susan nodded. That matters. My throat tightened. What does it mean? It means this wasn't something Daniel created after you were married. Whatever the purpose was, he was thinking about it before the wedding. I stared at her. So he planned this, I don't know that yet. She leaned back. And I don't want you deciding that before we have evidence. I appreciated that. I needed someone who wasn't going to tell me what I wanted to hear. Susan asked me about my mother's property. I explained that my mother had left me a small commercial building in Westerville. It had 2 retail spaces on the first floor and 3 offices upstairs. A local insurance agency rented one of the spaces and a tax preparer rented another. I had never considered myself wealthy because of it. It was just my mother's gift to me. Susan asked how much it was worth. I honestly don't know. She raised an eyebrow. I laughed. I know, that's probably not a very good answer. It might be the most important answer you've given me. She pulled up some records. The property was worth considerably more than I realized. I felt sick. Daniel knew about it. I had told him during our engagement while we were sitting at a Cracker Barrel outside Newark. I remember the conversation because he had asked about my mother's estate. He'd said, "That's wonderful. Your mom really took care of you." At the time, I thought he was being sweet. Now I remembered how many questions he'd asked. How much did it earn? Was there a mortgage? Who handled the leases? Was the property in my name? I had answered all of them. Susan asked me to write down everything I remembered about those conversations. I did. Then she asked about Karen Wallace. I told her what Daniel had said. Susan made a note. Don't contact Karen again. I already did. I know, that's why I'm telling you not to do it again. I nodded. Susan also told me not to move money cancel accounts, confront Daniel, or secretly record private conversations. Let him continue behaving normally, she said. The less he knows about what you're doing, the better. That was easier said than done. That night Daniel cooked dinner. Chicken breasts, roasted potatoes, and green beans. He even washed the dishes afterward. Then he came over and rubbed my shoulders while we stood in the kitchen. You've been quiet lately, he said. I've had a lot on my mind. About us, I turned around. Why would you ask that? He smiled. Because I love you. I wanted to believe him. That was the hardest part. I didn't hate Daniel. Not yet. I was angry, hurt, confused. But there were still pieces of the man I had married that I loved. And every time he was kind to me, it became harder to accept what I was beginning to discover. That night I lay awake beside him. He was sleeping peacefully. I watched the clock change from 2:13 to 2:14. I thought about the wedding, the flowers, the cake, my sister fixing the strap on my dress because I was shaking so badly. Daniel taking my hand before we walked into the reception. He had whispered, "It's finally just us." At the time, those words had made me smile. Now they hurt. 2 days later, Karen called me. "I'll meet you," she said. We chose a coffee shop in Westerville during the afternoon. I arrived early and sat near the window. Karen walked in wearing jeans, a gray sweater, and the same guarded expression I had seen in the hotel photograph. She sat down. "You look tired. So do you." That almost made her smile. I deserve that. I wrapped both hands around my coffee. "Tell me the truth." Karen looked out the window. Daniel wasn't having an affair with me. I hadn't realized until then how much I had feared that. So what were you doing together, trying to fix something he had already started? What? She looked directly at me. Your property. I couldn't speak. Karen continued. Daniel and I owned a small consulting company together. He was good at sales, very good. But he had a habit of seeing other people's money as a solution to his problems. What problems? Debt, bad investments, credit cards, a business loan. She told me the company had started losing money. Daniel wanted to restructure it. Karen refused because he wanted to use outside assets as collateral. My name wasn't going on that. So he created the LLC. Karen nodded. He created it after he met you. Before we were engaged. Yes. I felt the room get smaller. Why didn't you tell me I tried? When 3 weeks before your wedding? I stared at her. She reached into her purse and placed several printed pages on the table. Emails. Daniel had written to Karen about my property. One sentence made my hands go cold. Once we're married, she'll trust me enough to sign. I read it twice. Then a third time. Karen watched me. I should have stopped him. You couldn't. I could have tried harder. I looked at her. You came to my wedding. Yes. Why? To give him one last chance to back out. I looked down at the email. Did he? Karen shook her head. No. She took a sip of coffee. There's something else. I looked up. What he met with someone at the Hawthorne Hotel 2 days before your wedding. Who his lawyer? My heart began pounding. About what Karen shook her head, I don't know. Then she gave me the address of the hotel meeting room, and suddenly Frank's security footage came back to me. The hotel manager hadn't just shown me one strange meeting. He had shown me the beginning of a trail. I called Frank from my car. Frank, I need to ask you about another night. There was a pause. Then he said, I know which night you mean. My hand tightened around the steering wheel. Do you still have the footage? Yes. And this time I knew exactly what I was going to ask him to show me. The next morning I sat in my car outside the Hawthorne Hotel for almost 20 minutes before I went inside. I had the strangest feeling that once I walked through those doors again, there would be no going back. Frank was waiting for me. He looked more serious than he had the first time. You're sure you want to see this? Yes. He nodded and brought me into the office. This footage is from 2 days before your wedding. He pulled up the recording. The timestamp read 8:16 p.m. Daniel walked into the hotel wearing a navy suit. He looked exactly the way he had looked during our engagement dinner. Confident, relaxed, like a man who believed everything was going according to plan. A few minutes later, another man entered the frame. Susan had already told me his name, Daniel's attorney. They sat in a private meeting room. Frank increased the volume. The audio was faint, but we could hear enough. Daniel said once the transfer is done, there shouldn't be a problem. The attorney replied, not unless she refuses to sign. Daniel laughed. She won't. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not suspicion, not a feeling, his voice, his confidence. My own husband had been sitting in that hotel 2 days before our wedding discussing what he expected me to sign. Frank paused the video. Do you want to stop? No. He continued. Daniel slid a folder across the table. The attorney opened it. I couldn't read everything, but I saw my name. Then Daniel said something that made my stomach turn. She doesn't need to understand all of it. I'll explain it as part of the business restructuring. I looked at Frank. That's enough. He stopped the recording. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap. For the first time I understood what Frank had meant when he told me the footage was terrible. It wasn't one bad decision. It was a plan. And I had almost walked straight into it. I called Susan from the parking lot. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, do not confront him. I wasn't planning to. Good. What happens now? Now we document everything. That was the least dramatic answer imaginable. It was also exactly what I needed. Over the next several days, Susan helped me obtain copies of the public records and financial documents we were legally entitled to access. Karen gave us the emails she had saved. Frank provided the hotel footage through the proper process. Nothing happened quickly. That was one of the hardest parts. I wanted Daniel exposed immediately. Instead, I had to wait. I had to eat dinner with him. I had to listen to him talk about work. I had to pretend I wasn't counting every lie. One evening he came home carrying a grocery bag. I got the cereal you like. I looked at the box. Honey Nut Cheerios. Something so ordinary that it almost broke me. Thanks. He smiled. You okay? I'm fine. He kissed my cheek. I stood there and let him. Then he said, I think we should refinance the house. My body went still. Why lower the payment? Free up some cash. What would we do with it? Invest it. I looked at him. He had no idea what I knew. Let me think about it. He frowned. Why do you always have to think about everything? Because it's a big decision. He walked away. I went into the bathroom and shut the door. I stared at myself in the mirror. I was 48 years old. I had built a life before Daniel. A career, a home, friends, a relationship with my sister. A quiet confidence I hadn't even realized I possessed. And somehow, in 1 month, I had started asking myself whether I was allowed to say no to my own husband. That realization hurt more than the financial betrayal. 2 weeks later, Daniel announced he wanted to have dinner with both families. Nothing formal, he said, just dinner. I knew immediately. He was preparing the ground. He wanted his family to see him as the responsible husband and me as the difficult wife. Susan agreed. Let him talk, she said. The dinner was held in a private room at a restaurant near Easton Town Center. There were 12 of us. My sister was there. Daniel's brother was there. Karen sat at the far end of the room. Frank stood near the entrance. Daniel looked at him and frowned. What's he doing here? Frank answered calmly. Rachel asked me to come. Daniel looked at me. I said nothing. Dinner started quietly. Then Daniel stood. He raised his glass. I married Rachel because I love her. My sister looked down at her plate. I kept my hands folded. Daniel continued. We've had some challenges adjusting to married life. Then he looked at me. Rachel has been under a lot of stress lately. She's become suspicious of normal financial decisions. There it was, the story he had prepared. He placed a folder on the table. I think we need to simplify things. He pushed the folder toward me. I just want us to combine everything properly. I looked at the papers. Then I looked around the table. I think everyone should see something first. Daniel's face changed. I nodded toward Frank. He connected his laptop to the television. The first video appeared. Daniel meeting Karen on our wedding night. The room went silent. Then came the second clip. Daniel handing Karen the brown envelope. Someone whispered, "What the hell?" Daniel stood up. "This is completely out of context." I didn't answer. I put the property records on the table. The LLC was created 6 months before our wedding. Daniel shook his head. That doesn't mean anything. I placed the email Karen had given me beside it. He read the first line. His face went pale. My sister picked it up. She read it aloud. Once we're married, she'll trust me enough to sign. Nobody moved. Daniel looked at Karen. You did this. Karen stood. You did this to yourself. Daniel's brother stared at him. You knew about her property before you married her? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I finally spoke. You were right about one thing, Daniel. He looked at me. I trusted you. I paused. You were wrong about what that meant. Nobody applauded, nobody shouted. That made it more powerful. People simply sat there and looked at him. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel had no explanation ready. I gathered my things and walked out. In the parking lot, my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't unlock my car. I leaned against the door and cried, not because I regretted exposing him, because I was finally admitting that the man I had married had never been the man I thought he was, and there was still a long road ahead. The divorce did not end the story. If anything, that was when the difficult part began. People sometimes imagine that once the truth comes out, everything becomes simple. You show the evidence, the bad person gets exposed, and you walk away feeling relieved. That wasn't how it happened for me. Daniel fought. He challenged the financial records. He questioned the emails Karen had provided. He claimed the hotel footage had been misinterpreted. At one point, he even suggested that Karen had convinced me to turn against him because she was bitter about their old business relationship. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't cost me so much sleep. There were legal bills. There were meetings with Susan. There were documents to review and signatures to make. There were evenings when I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of me and wondered how a marriage that had lasted barely 2 months could create so much paperwork. Daniel also tried to make me feel guilty. One night he called. Rachel, do you really want to do this? I was standing in my bedroom folding a sweater. Do what? Destroy everything we built? I looked around the room. There wasn't much we had built together. Most of what was in that house had belonged to me before we married. Still, I said, "You didn't build my life, Daniel." He was silent. Then he said, "You believed me." "Yes." "So why can't you believe me now?" I closed my eyes. "Because now I know what you were saying when you thought I wasn't listening." He hung up. I stood there for a long time with the phone in my hand. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. There were days when I blamed myself. How could I have missed it? How could I have sat across from this man at restaurants and never questioned why he asked so much about my mother's property? How could I have heard him say, "Once we're married, we'll take care of everything together," and never wonder what he meant? Susan stopped me one afternoon when I started blaming myself again. We were sitting in her office reviewing another stack of documents. She put down her pen. "Rachel." I looked up. "You trusted someone who presented himself as trustworthy. I didn't say anything. That doesn't make you foolish. It feels foolish." "I understand." She slid a folder toward me. "But don't confuse being kind with being responsible for another person's dishonesty." That sentence stayed with me. The legal process eventually protected my mother's property. The LLC arrangement Daniel had created fell apart. The bank accounts were separated. The house and the assets I had brought into the marriage were protected according to the law and our documentation. Daniel didn't lose everything. That wasn't my goal. I didn't want him homeless. I didn't want revenge that required destroying another human being. I wanted my life back, and I wanted him to understand that he could not quietly take what wasn't his. Months later, I went back to the Hawthorne Hotel. I hadn't told Frank I was coming. He was standing behind the front desk when I walked in. He recognized me immediately. "Rachel." "Hi, Frank." He smiled. "How are you doing better?" We talked for a few minutes. Then I thanked him. He looked uncomfortable. "I still don't know if I should have called you." "You should have. I was worried I'd be crossing a line." "You probably were." He laughed. I laughed too. Then I said, "But you did the right thing." He nodded. "I just showed you what we had." "No," I said. "You showed me something I wasn't ready to see." Before I left, I walked through the same dark wood, the same brass light fixtures, the same piano near the entrance. It looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe because the first time I had walked through those doors, I thought I was walking into the beginning of my new life. Now I understood I had been walking into the place where I would eventually discover the truth. When I got home, I opened the closet and found the wedding photograph. I stared at it. There I was, 48 years old, smiling, holding flowers, standing beside a man I thought I knew. For a long time, I couldn't look at that picture without feeling embarrassed. Then something changed. I stopped feeling sorry for the woman in the photograph. She hadn't known. She had loved someone. She had believed what he told her. There was nothing shameful about that. I put the photograph in a box. I didn't throw it away. I kept it because I wanted to remember something important. Not Daniel, me. The woman I had been before everything fell apart. The woman who had trusted too easily, perhaps. But also the woman who, when the truth finally appeared, had the courage to face it. A few months later, Linda and I started having coffee on Saturday mornings. Sometimes we'd sit at Panera. Sometimes we'd grab coffee from Starbucks and walk around Dublin's historic district if the weather was decent. She never asked me whether I regretted marrying Daniel. One morning she finally did. I thought about it. "No," I said. She looked surprised. "Really, I regret marrying the wrong man." I smiled. "But I don't regret learning that I can survive being wrong about someone." Linda nodded. "That sounds like something Susan would say." I laughed. "Probably." My life became quieter after that. I went back to work. I started taking weekend trips. I visited my sister more often. I finally cleaned out the spare bedroom where we'd piled all the wedding gifts. I even learned to enjoy eating dinner alone. That surprised me. Before Daniel, I had always been afraid that being alone meant something was missing. Now I understood that sometimes being alone simply meant there was room to breathe. Looking back, the phone call from Frank didn't destroy my marriage. It gave me the chance to see it clearly. If he hadn't called, I might have signed those papers. I might have refinanced the house. I might have transferred control of my mother's property without understanding what I was doing. I might have spent years wondering why the man I loved kept asking me for more and more. Instead, I got a warning. And this time I listened. I've learned that trusting someone doesn't mean ignoring the little things that don't make sense. And protecting yourself doesn't mean becoming bitter. Sometimes it simply means asking one more question. If you've ever had a moment when something didn't feel right, I hope you remember